This week we're going to be going through the book of Esther. We just did a kind of a personal heart review that wasn't recorded. I may just touch on some points, and that's what I was speaking to you guys about was in the context of where the people of Israel are at this time. We just recently went through Ezra and Nehemiah, which we know were during a time of restoration, where some of the exiles were allowed to go back to Jerusalem and begin to repair the walls of Jerusalem, and then they also began a foundational work on the temple. But let's remember, why is Israel where they are? I mean, this is a period of time after the reign of King David, the great king after God's own heart. The king and kings, David and Solomon, under whom the nation of Israel was residing in peace and prosperity. I had referred to the illustration that I believe is in Isaiah. Maybe it's in Jeremiah, I'm not sure, about the vineyard. It's like the parable or illustration of the vineyard that the Lord speaks through the prophets, talking about the way that God did everything for Israel. From Egypt to coming into the promised land, even through their rebellion in the wilderness, the giving of the law, which was meant to be a blessing to the people, to protect them, to teach them, to tutor them. Through the time of the judges, the people continued to rebel, wanted a man as a king, not God. Hard-hearted, stiff-necked people. Always wanted to be like the nations around them. Always influenced by the nations around them. But God continued to provide everything they needed. So truly that illustration that is given by the prophet is well, obviously it's accurate. It came from the very heart of God. He said, this is what my people are like. I gave them everything. Every provision, everything that would be needed for my purposes to be produced in their midst. But they weren't. So when the law was given and by Moses, and the period of the wilderness was fulfilled, they began their conquest in the promised land with many more mistakes and rebellions. David ultimately brought some completion to the conquest. Israel was at peace. Nations around them served them. Their borders were secure. They even had a righteous king. But they never became the people. They never produced the culture of the heart and the house of God. I mean, if we look at it just from the sense of the calendar that was given to the people of God for their celebrations, for their times, for their years, for their seasons, their kingdom under David and Solomon's rule did not even endure in righteousness long enough to celebrate one year of Jubilee. The Jubilee cycle was that of 49 years, with the 50th year being the year of Jubilee. Not once. And the very next generation with Solomon, the kingdom was divided because their hearts were divided. And remember when the law was given by Moses? Blessings and curses. It's not like God was standing there with his hand held up ready to smash people. He gave an order of life there. Divine obedience produces divine blessing. Disobedience and rebellion bring destruction and scattering. Here we are. The nation of Israel is destroyed. The walls are torn down. The temple's torn down. Nothing is left. And the people are scattered over the face of the earth. Literally. But there's a time of restoration through Nehemiah and Ezra. Now, in the midst of this time, this is where we find ourselves in Esther, during the Medo-Persian Empire, after the Babylonian Empire. So we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah the mentioning of these names here in chapter 1 says very clearly, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. And he reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. So this is during the time where the exile is coming, the Babylonian exile is coming to an end. And he is one of the ruling emperors or kings in the Medo-Persian Empire over a certain number of provinces, in which and among which the Jews are dispersed, still not in their homeland, which it was described of with Mordecai and then with his niece, Hadassah, also known as Esther. Her parents had died. She had been orphaned, and he was raising her. We're not going to go into all the prophetic implications of this book, but I do want to say that there are many. In terms of Esther being representative of the bride of Christ and the people of God, the church, and the fulfillment of the purposes of God. Esther is the book is a very incredible story. I mean, I become fearful in reverence to God every time I read this book. Because the timing of God, the working out of the purpose of God, and the statement of the purpose and the ways of God in it, specifically through Mordecai, are pretty incredible. Mordecai was a man of God and a righteous man. He also understood the ways of God. There are also some literary themes here in relation to writing style and other, which we won't focus on a whole lot, but there is one term that I will mention, which is it's called poetic justice, which is when something is fulfilled in a way that is the perfect justice to what was being met out. So this specifically is done with the interaction between the king, Esther, Mordecai, and Haman. And the reason I'm mentioning this, let me see if there's an actual definition for poetic justice. The fact of experiencing a fitting or deserved retribution for one's actions. So, poetic justice is you made certain choices and decisions and actions, and you got exactly what you deserved. Now, one of the perspectives that I want us to have with this, continuing with this book, in terms of the purpose of God, which we're going to see both in this book and as we move into Job next week, is that God's will working out juxtaposed with the work of the enemy. We will also, in other studies, whether that's in the prophetic books or otherwise, view the context of the work or the enemy as a tool in God's hands. The perspective that we have here in relation to the fulfillment of God's purpose is that the enemy has on many occasions literally tried to wipe out, kill, utterly destroy the people of God. We saw it in Egypt with the slavery, with the killing of the infants. We see that same thing happen later on as they are attacked by other nations. We see it happen in Jesus' life. And it's happened in similar ways in modern days. Like in the World Wars, when the Nazi regime was determined to destroy all Jews. Everywhere. Those are satanic forces at work in the governments of man. I mean, look at what came against Ezra and Nehemiah. But here we see an attempt to utterly destroy a people. All of them. And there was even incentives given to do so. So the reason I'm mentioning that, it's obvious in the story, but I want us to see the enemy's attempts and perspective in this to literally wipe out, snuff out the people of God and the purpose of God in and through his people. And his plans are always frustrated, and even more so, they are completely turned over. So before we go into some of the details of the story, which are fairly plain, we won't spend a whole lot of time reading through various scriptures here except for a few passages. This book, again, even as we looked through Ezra and Nehemiah, now in Esther, this is a very prophetic time. And again, by prophetic, I'm not talking about predicting the future. I'm saying that you and I are living in a time where certain things are actually being fulfilled as a reality. In the restoration of God's purpose. We saw that very clearly in Ezra and Nehemiah. One of the perspectives that I want us to hold right now as a sober reality is that the enemy is targeting us. We've known that for over a year now. That the enemy has a very, very sharp sight put on us as a people to try and destroy us as a people, separate us as a people, wipe us out. There's a vendetta there. He doesn't want the purpose of God to move up on, and he will do anything. But what we will see is that God is literally going to turn the table. Those words are used here. I know it's the English translation, but those actual words are used. The turning of the table. And I want us to see very clearly, and not in a general sense, that while the enemy's hand is raised for destruction, that God has appointed a person specifically for such a time as this. You see, it's not a question of whether or not God will be able to fulfill his purposes. We've talked about this before. Guys, many generations have gone. Look, we were just talking about a king, King David and King Solomon, who reigned thousands of years ago. We had Jesus come and fulfill many things in order that the full purpose of God can be achieved in creation. But look, we're 2,000 years after Jesus' life. Why have we not seen the full redemption and the full fulfillment, achievement, accomplishment of God's purpose? God's looking for the right people. But let me say this. Time is on his side because he created time. He's outside of it. God's not buying years. He's waiting for a people with the right heart. Heart of faith and obedience. Those who will not count their own lives as precious. We see that example here with Esther. So let's review the story. But let's take courage in the poetic justice here. And in the righteousness of the life ahead of time. Could Mordecai have known that his righteous approach to the king, who was not a God-appointed king, well, yes, put in authority and power by God, but we're not talking, he's in a foreign nation, a foreign king, in a foreign country, and he's a servant. As Nehemiah and Ezra were, as Daniel was, they were captives, serving the purposes of other foreign kings, and God used them anyway. God used the kings anyway. God gave King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon one of the most incredible dreams about his purposes that we know in Scripture. Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue was a full telling of the purpose of God throughout the entire history of man, given to a pagan king. And he dealt heavily with Nebuchadnezzar's life. But Mordecai couldn't have known at this point. This is separate from that, obviously. Now we're in the Medo-Persian Empire, which is after the Babylonian Empire. We still have people that are coming out of captivity. They do not have a homeland. They do not have a city. They don't have a temple. They don't have a way of life. They don't have a king. They don't have a kingdom. But they trust and believe in the purposes of their God nonetheless. For his people, they're still believing in the promises of God. There are people like Mordecai that know that God has done exactly what he said he would do. They know why. Look at what Nehemiah and Ezra said. Here's why we're here. Because we as a nation completely disobeyed, forfeited God's purpose. That's why this is happening. But God also promised that if we would humble ourselves and return to him, then he would return to us. And he would establish us as a people. So although they are in this scattered state, there are a remnant, who hold on to the promise and the purpose of God, and therefore maintain the righteous standard of life that is required by him, even though they have no kingdom, no nation. Mordecai does this. We see that in the example here. So there are some things in this book that kind of set up the order of this current kingdom so that we can understand the events that are taking place here and the risks that are being taken. The first queen, Vashti, is in many ways representative of a rebellious church, wanting to do her own thing, not wanting to be used by the king for his purposes. And so what? She is never invited to come into the king's court again. You're not even a queen anymore. I'll find another queen with the right heart. There's some details of the story that may confuse that in terms of how the young ladies were treated or as concubines or those kinds of things. We're not going to focus on that. I just want us to see the overall continuation of God's heart, but also the prophetic implications of the women and the men in the story. Because their lives don't just represent their own lives. That's the way we need to read Scripture. So Vashti is separated. Esther is made queen and prepared for, or to be presented to the king. That preparation is very much indicative or symbolic of the preparation of the bride of Christ to be examined by and approved by the groom, the king, Jesus. Very clear. So then we come into the end of chapter 2 and we see that Mordecai uncovers a conspiracy that some guards had to kill the king. So there were a lot of documentation. Basically, a king back then had a scribe that would literally follow him around. There were several scribes, okay? One was always with the king, and others were also writing out the events that happened around the king's court. They recorded everything. This is what happened today. The king didn't have to write that himself. This is what the king did. This is where he went. This is who he talked to. These are the decisions that were made. So there are other things that, as the king had other nobles and officials that helped him run the government of his house, they made records of all of it. And there were things that happened that sometimes the king did not fully know of, but they were recorded. And this particular king, Xerxes, at one point, we know in the story, he couldn't sleep one night, so he had a scribe come and say, read to me some of the things that have been going on in the kingdom. And that's where my fear and awe comes in this book, because it was so near. And it was really awkward how Haman plotted. So Mordecai uncovers this. He saves the king's life because there were people who were planning to assassinate the king. He uncovers the plot that was found to be true. They get rid of the men that were doing that, and Mordecai goes on his way. He's paying special attention to his niece, Esther, who has been taken and made queen. I mean, can you imagine this? A young Jewish girl in a foreign country made to be the queen of a mighty empire. There are other rulers in this kingdom, Haman being one. Very full of pride. selfishness. I know these seem like simple things, but you can see how far they go and how much they can be used by the enemy to destroy a people. Mordecai would not bend his knee, so to say, to the ways of these people. And he became an agitation. So in chapter 3, we see one of these intended purposes that the enemy used in this man. So Mordecai will not follow their ways. He's reported as not doing so. Verse 5 in chapter 3. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. You guys, this is a very similar thing that the enemy has done to man all the time. Come and pay honor to me, to my ways, and I will honor you if you do so. And is that not what Satan said to Jesus in the wilderness as well? He just said, no, I will only honor my Father in his ways. So we see that same heart. Verse 6, yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Do you see that? The people represent something else. We saw that with Ezra and Nehemiah during this time. We see the movement of the enemy in the midst of the nations here to continue to try and destroy God's purpose in the midst of his people. Remember when the rulers around Nehemiah and Ezra and these other towns and stuff, what did they say when they wrote their letters to the kings? Hey, look at the history of this people. They always cause trouble. Let's get rid of them. They're rebellious people. They're not good for our kingdom. So again, we see the purpose of God in his people being targeted, not just the man. Even Haman saw that. This isn't about this one guy's beliefs. This is about this whole people and what they represent. So he scorned the idea of only killing Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So he had an edict put out. Now, in this time, in the laws of the Medes and Persians, based on what their kings did, when a king gave a decree and sealed it with his signet ring, it literally could not be undone. Even the king couldn't say, okay, I changed my mind. We're going to do something different now. That was the law of the Medes and Persians. We saw the same thing. We will see the same thing happen with Daniel. With Darius, the king, who once there was an order given that a certain punishment had to be played out, they were at the mercy of that law, not even their own selves. There is a law of destruction. I want us to see this spiritually as well. There are spiritual laws that are unchangeable, that are activated and put into play. That is why blood is required for the covenant. That's why there's an accuser of the brethren. That's why there was a law. That's why there is a sacrificial system. To atone. Because of the law, the unchangeable law. So remember, once Daniel was put in the lion's den, the king said, I can't change it. He has to be thrown in. He felt terrible about it, but it had to be done. Here, something similar. This decree had been made. So he brings this to King Xerxes. He says, this is verse 8. There's a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom whose customs, their culture, their way of life. Are you hearing that? This is a target on the culture of God's house, not on a person. That's why I want to tell you how relevant this is to us. Let's see very clearly what the enemy is against. There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs, whose culture, whose way of life is different from those of all other people. Do you see how unique that is? And who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. That word tolerate kind of brings a key to me in later, after Jesus and in the later ministry of the apostles, when they were still under Roman rule and there was a great persecution, that it was Constantine who finally released the what? The edict, again, this is an edict, of toleration. And it became the great harlotry of the church. Because there is not a mixture in the ways of God. Mordecai's fortitude here is a representation of that. So he says, if it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I'll pay you for it. 10,000 talents of silver. So the king took his signet ring from his finger, gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. See, there's a very specific description here. His name means magnificent. Guys, this is like, it's like a description of Satan himself. The enemy of the Jews. The purpose of God in that people. He pointed out the purpose of them. He pointed out their culture, their way of life, and said, that's what I want to destroy. And his name is a direct reference to the magnificence of what? Who? The angel Lucifer. Magnificent. Glorious. The king is representative of God. Not that God is ignorant or did not know something as King Xerxes didn't. But there is a part to play here. And God will have his retribution and judgment. And we'll see that. So the decree is put out. Verse 13, dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate. I mean, can we get a little bit more descriptive here? That's like kill again, and then make sure it's dead. Beat the dead horse. Destroy utterly this people. I'm spending time describing this because I want us to be very well aware of the enemy's intentions for us. Listen, young and old, women and little children on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. So, kill them twice, make sure they're dead, destroy them, spread them out, and then take all their stuff. Copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. This was almost a year in advance that this edict went out to make sure that everyone had time to prepare to destroy the people. Let's plan it. Let's make sure it happens. Let's make sure it's complete. And it's a law. Because of the law. So, 15, spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. And the king and Haman sat down to drink. Sent out the law, did their own thing, but the city of Susa was bewildered. It's like it came out of nowhere. Can you imagine that law? You get a paper in the mail, someone comes to your door, hands it to you, and you read this, And either you're a Jew or you're not, and you're like, what? It says it put the city in complete confusion. Stirred everything up. Mordecai hears of it, and he goes to mourn at the king's gate and is inconsolable. So Esther sends to find what's going on. Mordecai says, you must intercede for the people. And here's how Esther responded. Verse 10 of chapter 4, because she's unable to communicate directly to Mordecai, so she's communicating through the eunuchs who are in charge of the women of the house. Verse 11, she says, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know, this is a law, that for any man or woman who approaches the king in his inner court without being summoned, in other words, you are not called to come here. You can't come here on your own accord. You only come here if the king calls you. Who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law. You're put to death. You have no right to come here unless you're asked. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the golden scepter to him and spare his life. And 30 days have passed since the last time the king called me to his court. So she says, if I go there, the law says I must die. See, do you see the big picture here? The law says I must die. We must be willing to die, to lay our life down for the purpose of God. And to whom are we giving our life? The king. It's his decision. Now, Mordecai's response to Esther is one of the key passages in this book, and the one that we're most familiar with. When Esther's words, verse 12, were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, that you alone of all the Jews will escape. And now he says something directly touching on the ways of God and the purpose and the fulfillment of God's purposes. For if you remain silent, verse 14, at this time, a statement of faith here, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. God will not allow this to forfeit, but you and your father's family will perish. Let me give you another perspective, Esther. Who knows? But that you have come to royal position, that it was the precise, specific, predetermined will of God that you be put in this royal position for such a time as this. Do we look at our lives that way? He's saying, look at your life in the context of God's purpose. Each one of you sitting here today, listening. Are you looking at your life that in the course of all human history, God set you apart for this moment in time so that his purpose could be fulfilled? You better know the purpose of God. And are you willing to yield your life to it? So Esther says, gather all the Jews in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my maids will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. I will give my life for it. So they fasted and prayed for 3 days. Now this is where things get very interesting and poetic. Because Haman is continuing on in his... he thinks he's got it all under control. The edict is passed. It's been set out. He will have his full revenge on Mordecai and the people of Mordecai. It's legally done. The date has been set. Destruction is guaranteed. And Esther comes before the king. The king shows favor to her, extends the scepter, and says, I'll give you anything you want because you please me. So she says, set up the banquets. I mean, look at how God is setting the enemy up, guys, and how he's setting up his people. So when Esther is, listen, at the same time, that Esther's having the banquet, Mordecai and Haman still has this big problem with Mordecai and is completely enraged, hates the guy, literally to his core, but doesn't know what's going on in the background here. So at the same time that Esther requests that the king and Haman come to a banquet to eat with them, Haman is thinking, man, I've got it all. And now I have the blessing of this queen, this beautiful young lady, wants me to be there, and I'm honored by the king, and I'm honored, he just passed this edict for me. I can do anything I want. I have everything I want. And now I'm going to take advantage. So he goes and he brags to his family and his friends at dinner. And he talks about all his wealth and all his power and all his influence. The guy is riding high in pride. He's so puffed up. Guys, this isn't talking about, yes, it is talking about pride and how that affects a man and selfishness and all these things. But this is the downfall of the enemy. He openly believes that he can destroy in this way. He's encouraged by his friends to do so. They think, let's make this really a public display of your prowess, of your power, of your wealth, of your influence. Why don't you have a massive gallows built? Okay, it's not enough to kill the guy. We're going to make a public display of death that is extraordinary. And we're going to kill all his people. So they go really extravagant. And he does it so much that he wants it to be done right in front of his house so that he can show his power. So he has a gallows built. It's a long, sharp pole built 75 feet high. That is really high. Upon which Mordecai or whoever the victim would be pushed over onto that pole, pierced by it, and their body would slide down and hang on it. And it would be up at a high place so that everyone could see the death. And then take his house and all his possessions. And do it quickly. So he's set. He's going to do it. He has the gallows built immediately. He spares no expense for time or money. He has this built. He's excited about it. Look, this suggestion delighted Haman. And he had the gallows built. That's in verse 15 of chapter, maybe it's 14 of chapter 5. That night, verse 6. I think of the work of God, the move of God, and this is just incredible. Why does a man not sleep? What troubles the heart of a king? That night the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles. What? All the events that's been going on to be brought in and read to him. And it was found that Mordecai had exposed this plot to kill the king. The same night, an event that already had happened, but the same night that Haman is in there planning all this, having the gallows built, so that he can say, The edict's done. Now we need to get rid of this guy, Mordecai, and he's going to make his way to the king. So as he is saying those words, the king can't sleep that night. Haman's staying up, getting drunk with his buddies and bragging, and he's having this gallows built. And then the next day, he's going to the king to say, hey, I want to do this. That night, that same night, the king is reading this, and he hears that Mordecai saved his life, and he says, man, who has done this? We need to honor this guy. And then he hears footsteps in his palace, and he says, who's there? And Haman was coming to the king, all excited because of what he was doing, the plan that he had, and he was still high on his position. Verse 5, his attendants answered, it's Haman. He's just standing in the court looking for the king. Oh, bring him in, the king said. So look at these two purposes come together right here. The purpose of the enemy and the purpose of God. The enemy has come to steal, kill, and destroy. But I have come that you may have life and its abundance. Now look at these purposes converge. And look at what Haman thinks. The king says, what should be done for the man that the king delights to honor? And you know what the first thing Haman thinks is? Well, he must be talking about me. What perfect timing. I mean, I'm going to ask everything of the king right now. Well, here's what you should do. This is just getting better and better. I've got the edict. I've got the position. I've got the power. I've got the money. I've got this queen meeting with only me. I'm the most special guy in the whole kingdom. And now this great, awesome king wants to honor me anymore. Well, here's what you should do. Take your best robe and your best horse and your most noble man and put this guy that you want to honor in the king's robe, on the king's horse, and have your most honored noble lead that man through the town and shout to everyone, this is what is done for the man who the king wants to honor. Haman can picture himself on the horse. He's looking at the eyes of the people. He's taking all the glory in already. It's done. You know what this is a picture of? It's the picture of that guy that's running the bike race, and he gets like 20 feet before the ribbon, and he's got his arms up. You know that? And then he's like, and he falls off before he wins the race. But he thinks it's done. It's over. And then he says, the king says, verse 10, go at once. Go do it right now. Get the robe, the horse that you have suggested for Mordecai. Can you imagine what happened inside that guy? Bad day. Not a lot described about that. So Haman got the robe, the horse, robed Mordecai. He robed Mordecai. He led them on horseback. He made a public display. It's a shame. He had to proclaim about Mordecai, the man he loathed and hated. This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh's wife and all his friends everything that had happened. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started. You see, you can't just, it's not that you can't destroy this man. It's that you just made an edict against the people of the man who was honored by the king. He's of Jewish origin. You see, there we go. This man represents and carries the purpose of God in that people. You will surely, your downfall has started. You cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Your plan has failed. As they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and took Haman away to the next banquet. and she exposes him. Spare my people, verse 3, for this is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction. If we had merely been sold as slaves, then I would have kept quiet, but no such distress would justify disturbing the king. In another version it says, I would have been quiet, but the compensation that our adversary offers cannot be compared with the loss the king would suffer. So King Xerxes asks, well, who is this man? And Haman's sitting there on the couch. And she says, it's this vile Haman. The king is completely outraged. He doesn't even have words to say, and he walks out onto his balcony to the garden. That's how angry he is. And Haman is terrified for his life. And he's groveling and pleading for the queen. She's sitting on the couch. And he's wailing and groping at her, saying, please spare my life. And the king comes back in to see Haman on top of the queen, falling onto her, pleading for his life. And he says, are you now going to molest the queen while she sits with me in the house? You see, again, the representative of the bride here. You're a dead man. As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. That means you're dead. Literally the snuffing out of life. And then what happened? Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, well, hey, Haman just built this gallows in front of his own house. And he had made it for Mordecai, the man you dishonored. So the king said, hang him on his own gallows. Now, the edict, the law of destruction could not be overturned, even though Haman's plot had been exposed and he had been killed. So the king sends out a new edict that says, on this same day, the Jewish people can rise up and destroy all their enemies. See, listen, the other law was still in place that gave right to the enemy of the Jews to kill them and take their stuff. But a new law, a new edict was released saying they can not only protect themselves, they can act out against their enemies and take all their possessions. And it says that when this edict went out, there was such a fear of the Jews. This is in verse starting in 15. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration for the Jews. It was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and every city where the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebration. And many people of other nationalities, listen, became Jews because the fear of the Jews had seized them. They gave their lives over to the purpose of God for that people. So they became one with that people, even though they weren't born as those people. A glimpse into the eternal purpose of God for mankind right there. So the Jews triumph on that day, but hear me out. They don't take any of the plunder from the people. The enemy is destroyed, but they choose not to use it in that way. This is also where we see the establishment of the celebration of Purim, which is a Jewish celebration that goes on until today. And then you find that not only did they overcome all of their enemies in the area, but Haman and his sons, his whole family, were hanged on the same gallows. And then that estate was given to Mordecai, his home, Haman's estate. And Mordecai became a great ruler in this time. And that's chapter 10. King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with the full account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king had raised him, they're written in the books of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai, the Jew, was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews, for the purpose of God in the midst of his people. Bless the Lord for his work. We'll finish there today. And we're going to read through Job chapter 18. So you'll want to read approximately three chapters a day this week to make sure that you're able to stay up with that, which isn't too bad. These are not incredibly long chapters. So that takes us up to one of Job's responses. And then we'll try and finish Job after that. Well, maybe not. We'll get through it. There's a lot of response here. Job is a pretty massive book, but we may only take 2 weeks to get through it so that we can continue on. There are some primary things. There's a lot of details in Job in relation to some responses from his friends while they had not fully understood the purpose of God in working in Job. There's a lot of valuable things that they say in relation to the ways of God that are still true. So we don't want to just discount everything that they say just because they had misjudged Job in terms of some of the wisdom that is. We got to know that there's a reason that everything that they said was recorded. So, Lord, I pray that your purpose be fully accomplished in our midst. Lord, that the work of the enemy not only be undone, but completely turned back on his own head, even as you have shown through the lives of these people. Esther, Mordecai, the people of the Jewish nation, Lord, and the kings, the ruling kings. Lord, I pray that you would look upon your people even now and have mercy. And turn the table, turn the tide. Let everything that the enemy has done be turned on his own head, especially all that is against your purpose in your people. In Jesus' name, amen.